So, okay, let's talk more about the Maori language thing. So there's two things you've said that I think are really interesting things to get into.
Yes.
And we've been
they are.
talking for a long time and sort of like meandering around stuff. It's maybe not necessarily about language, and that's my fault as host. I should maybe try to keep us on the rails a little bit more. But it's because I haven't talked to you in a while, and it's interesting to talk about all this different stuff. But one, about the fact that New Zealand English itself was not so common to hear on TV growing up, and like what that's like. I think that's an experience that a lot of Americans can't analogize.
Yep.
That American English would not be the main form of English to hear on TV in America. That one, and then also the just the more about Maori, the Maori language and the way that how is it protected in New Zealand society, and how is it promoted, and like what role does it serve? Because there's other societies that I know a little bit about that have multilingual. The overall culture is a mix. Like Singapore is a pretty extreme example, or like Quebec has a sort of dual language system, and then there's patchy parts of America that are sort of dealing with the question with Spanish-speaking immigrants, and in a very typical American fashion, it's kind of just left to each local place to figure out in its own. And like Southern California has an approach to it that is often, like, for some reason controversial, to other parts. Like, they don't like the idea that things should be in Spanish and government things. But anyway, so how, whichever one of those you want to get into.
So
first.
The first question again.
So about what is that experience like? And I'm sorry, that's probably a big general amorphous question, but like of having New Zealand English, which is the English you heard spoken every day around you in school and stuff, never be on TV, and have this other dialect that you probably had never heard in real life up to a certain age.
So as I said, like growing up in the 80s, the kids' TV shows were typically American. So there were two TV channels at the time. They were both state-run channels, as they still are actually, Channel 1 and Channel 2, aptly named. And in my memory, Channel 1 was actually typically British British television shows and so forth. And then Channel 2 was the more youth-oriented or up-and-coming sort of channel at that time, and was maybe more American. So I think I remember Channel 1 being the boring one. So Channel 2 was the more entertaining one with American accents. And it was just the way the television spoke. It wasn't... so actually, now I'm getting on in age, but I'm still too young to actually remember, but I think it was around 1981, there was a music show where something like MTV, basically, a show, and it caused controversy. So I was only a couple of years old. I only know this from hearing of it. But I think a lot of people in New Zealand know that this the host decided to speak not with received pronunciation, British English, as was the standard then for when they did speak in New Zealand on TV.
So New Zealanders would speak in the Queen's...
Some sort of New Zealand variation of that, if you like. But this host, a woman, did not. She just spoke in her regular way. And so that apparently caused controversy at the time. And this is, I think, around 1980, 81, something like that. Yeah.
That's such an interesting phenomenon to me.
And I've never really looked into it. I'm just aware of that. But and then the media didn't really change until the late 80s when the economy was opened up and a bit more globalized. And I think the third channel, Channel 3, TV3, sorry, slightly different, came in, I think, 1989. And so then from there, then we have like TV expanding and from all over, but mostly American.
So
I would say.
You're saying that at the point in time at which hearing the true native New Zealand accent on TV, so by native I mean would say Pākehā.
Yeah, Pākehā.
The pronunciation of English on TV was controversial. You don't actually remember the controversy, or the feeling of people having like disagreements about it. Or... No.
All I remember is the it's sounding different. Like it didn't sound, to me at least, it didn't sound quite right, because the TV had always spoken a certain way. I just want to correct something you said there about the Pākehā pronunciation. That would imply it's the European New Zealand or white New Zealand pronunciation as if that were better than another.
Got it.
It's not.
Is that so that there's a good question that I hadn't even thought of. Is there a difference? Like, so this is something. Yeah, I know this is an extremely fraught thing, but in American English, I think that the role of local dialects often tends to be that of like incorrect or messy or whatever, and the standard American English, which is oddly not from a big city. It's not like the New York dialect or the Los Angeles dialect.
Right. I actually just saw something online about that yesterday or the day before.
Yeah.
About why that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was fascinating. The argument being on this video I was watching on YouTube was that the New York accent was not really liked so much because New York had always been a city of migrants. And so the migrants of whatever population of Europe or elsewhere were generally frowned upon. And then the southern accent, being the other one, was, of course, a majority black population with a slave economy. And so to whoever was in power at the time couldn't see that as being an appropriate dialect either.
Right.
And so it unusually moved away from, because typically you would have the biggest city would have
in Japanese it's Tokyo, for example.
Right. The biggest city would have the standard, would take this be taken as the standard language. Right. So that couldn't happen with New York being the biggest city.
Right.
Given the migrant population, and then southern states with a slave-based economic history being fraught, a very serious problem in the States. So it moved more to the Midwest, right?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, so this is a topic that Yuki, in the time we've been dating and married, that she's become very interested in accents of English, and I think because I watched the movie Fargo with her. And she's very into the Coen brothers, and I was like, oh, this is one of the oldest movies that she hadn't seen, and I was telling her that like the accent is a big part of that movie's overall atmosphere, and it's an accent that Americans often forget exists. And I think in that movie I've met people from Minnesota who tell me that it's a bit exaggerated or whatever, but as they were telling me that, I was hearing the Fargo accent and as they're speaking. So I think in the process of maybe watching movies with me and me making comments, she's become more aware of American or different English accents. Yeah. And one time we were hanging out with a British friend of mine, and Yuki asked the question, because she's aware of, like, from watching The Wire and stuff, that in American English, not only are accents regional, but they're also racialized. Yeah. There's accents that are, like, as you say, the southern, like what Americans would regard as like Black American English is a branch off of the southern family of dialects, right. Regardless of whether people now actually live in the South or not. And so Yuki asked my British friend, she's like, is there a Black British English? And my friend was just like, no. There might be a handful of slang terms that probably are not even every Black British person would use, but there's not, like in America or in the US, correctly or incorrectly, people will hear just the speaker's voice and make conclusions about the race, which my British friend, Yuki was interested in that, and my British friend said no. In the UK, there's no equivalent. It's not possible. There isn't such a tightly defined.
Right. I would assume in the UK it's more social.
Right. It's much more class. Economic and I guess it's not even economic, but social, as you say. Yeah. But Yuki was extremely fascinated by that, and she still talks about it all the time, about how, like, it says so much about the different history of migration and the role that race played in the identity of the two countries. But so I say all that to ask, like, is there a Maori dialect of English that sounds different than? Because I made the mistake earlier of saying Pakeha.
I just brought up that point about Pakeha because it is in itself a controversial term. So some people hold that it's an offensive term.
Oh, okay.
I would say the majority of New Zealand. Majority of New Zealanders.
That's a Japanese term.
Yeah, majority of New Zealanders would be okay with it. I think Pakeha, but I don't hear the term white I only use that here in Japan if I'm speaking in English, or if, for the benefit of Americans.
White people.
Yeah. So European New Zealanders, you'll see Pākehā / European New Zealander on a lot of government forms.
Okay.
It'll give that option.
Okay.
But that term is controversial, and I would say that it comes with a lot of baggage. So that's why I would say New Zealand television media moved more towards a general New Zealand accent, not a broad one.
Mm-hmm.
But a general sort of everyday accent. In regards to the Maori accent, there are features of Maori accents, Maori pronunciation in English. I'm not comfortable repeating those or saying those, and I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to explain them. Yeah.
Okay. I think you were telling me at one point in time in the past, I apologize, I may be completely misremembering, that there's actually also, I think, 2 distinct dialects of Maori, of the Maori language? Or am I misremembering that?
Yeah, I can't remember if I said that. I'm not an expert in this field.
But I don't mean to corner you on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is a modern standardized Maori, and then there is in the South Island, as I'm aware, there was originally a different accent, or a different dialect, I should say. But I think with the loss of the language during colonial times, and then a rebirth of the language, it's moved along standardized lines.
Oh.
So
to what extent was it lost? I wasn't aware that happened.
Well, it was your classic sort of colonial country where they would ban ban the language, or it was not allowed in schools, or it wasn't taught for a long time, and so forth. So the actual success, or ongoing slow success of Māori, and it's a very small percentage of the population that can speak it fluently, unfortunately. But the success really comes down to local groups, so wanting to preserve the language. So local community groups developed what are called kohanga reo, which are like language nests for promoting the Māori language. So there'll be I forgot the word, an immersive language environment for just Māori. And from there, and that was in the 70s.
An immersive language environment. What type of environment is that? Is that like
kindergarten?
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, kindergarten or early learning sort of center or something. And so from there they built it up, and it became something. And that was in the 70s, I believe, in the 60s and 70s. And so by the mid to late 70s, the government recognized finally that this was the way to go forward and preserve and promote the language by helping promote that. So now we have schools and Kura Kaupapa Māori, which are like Māori immersion schools, Māori language immersion schools, I should say, and Wananga, which are Māori language universities, and so forth. Yeah.
Outside of educational institutions, is there any other kind of activities or community?
So this is more into the second question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just interested in how I'm very fascinated because it sounds like a success story. How a language like that, how that, obviously schools are an obvious answer, but I'm curious about other methods for preserving and promoting the use of another language like that.
So a lot of it has come down to interpreting the treaty, and there was this very broad word taonga, which, as I said before, means treasures. So what the Māori have a right to have their treasures preserved and promoted, essentially. But that was very open to interpretation, the Māori. So I should say there's two language versions of the treaty, one in Māori, one in English. They're not exactly the same.
Okay.
And so that's part of the interpretation that's needed. And so with that basis of interpreting the treaty, the government is, and I would say all parties agree, they're obliged to fulfill those promises and so forth. So the government, typically everything is bilingual, It was a very New Zealand sort of accent, bilingual. Yeah. So all government documentation will be produced in English and in Māori,
Okay.
and signage and so forth. And it's generally taught in primary school with options and so forth. Beyond that, however, I will say it's hard to say if it's a complete success. And the rates are unfortunately still low compared to the use of English, and I believe that most people are bilingual in English and Māori, so it's not that there are only monolingual Māori speakers. There may be some. I'm not aware of the numbers. And the Māori population is generally a greater part of a percentage of the population in the North Island. So the successes are more likely in the North Island, I would say, than the South Island, which is predominantly Pākehā and more recently other migrant populations.
Okay.
So the region I'm from, when I was growing up, I read that it was only 1 in 20 were Māori, whereas much higher, the further north you go, the more dynamic the population is, I guess, rather than just British or English and Scottish settled areas. Yeah. So that has an impact on the language use and study.
Are there any instances, and I apologize, this is a very American question perhaps, was land taken from the Māori during colonization?
Yes.
Were they driven away from?
Yes.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So there was a time called the New Zealand Wars where land was just confiscated or taken over by force. Others were just, you sort of classic, we're just going to buy up this land from one person in the tribe and give them something in return.
I see.
Yeah, so a lot of confiscations and theft.
Leveraged buyouts.
Yeah, and as part of the treaty settlements, which have been ongoing since the 90s, each government has, to a greater or lesser extent, made reparations, which is, and not to say that that's the end of it, of healing the wounds, but so they've made reparations, compensated in terms of land, cultural artifacts, and money, and so forth. So you have some there are different tribes around the country, and some are huge, like the South Island tribe is, I think, all of the South Island, or most of it, and they received money which has now been used to develop their own iwi, their own tribe further. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't want to. Sorry, I asked you a few questions. I'm sort of asking you to speak for all of New Zealand or something. So I don't want to put you on the spot about that. And because there's so much other stuff about you individually that's interesting, we don't have to talk about New Zealand stuff. Thank you for sharing about it, because it's something that I didn't know much about before I met you. Yeah. And actually, it was good to talk to you today, because until this conversation, I think I had a rosier view of, as you said, New Zealanders kind of regard themselves as having bragging rights, and I perhaps bought into that, and I felt like, that the colonial New Zealanders didn't confiscate any land and didn't do anything bad to the Maori. Yeah. Like, it was just an equal merger of societies.
Yeah, I would think it's something that a lot of people buy into. Like, it's, we have never done anything as bad as other countries.
Bad as.
I know.
It's such an interesting, and every country does that.
Yeah.
Right? Every country goes, well, we didn't do this thing.
So I wouldn't be surprised if it's part of our modern national identity, where we have to sort of, explain that we're a little bit better in this regard, at least. And it may or may not be true. As I said to you at the beginning, I am a Pākehā New Zealander, so I can only speak from a perspective that I've learned or looked into a little bit myself. This would more than likely be very different from Māori New Zealand. I would
love to have a Māori New Zealander or 2 or 3 on here at some point as well. Yeah, so getting back to you a little bit, and we don't have a ton of time left, but are you okay on time?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Coronavirus.
Yeah, we're in our Corona cave, fallout shelter.
Corona time. This room would actually make a great little shelter, actually.
There's no window, right?
Yeah. You need some tinned food and some liquids and things, you'd be fine.
Yeah.
Internet, no problem.
Yeah. So getting back to you, how? So this is such a big question, and I don't want to sound too pretentious, but now as someone who speaks Russian rather fluently, as I understand, and Korean pretty fluently from what I've seen, and you can definitely handle working with Japanese people and speaking Japanese in that way. So I mean, you've got those three languages to a very functional level, as I can see. Obviously, I don't know about Korean and Russian, but how do you feel like that's changed your perspective on who you are or how you relate to other New Zealanders when you go back? And as I've said, you visit Russia and Russian speaking areas a lot. Right. There's a part of me, sometimes I'll jokingly refer to it with friends, or friends will refer to me that I'm some percent Osaka-jin, more than Japanese, right? I said that's a very English pronoun, Osaka-jin. No, but I'm some percent like a Osaka person, right? There's some part of, but I almost feel like it's not like percentages in my case. It's not like I'm this percent American and this percent Californian and this percent Japanese. It's more like I just have like multiple personalities.
Yeah. I was thinking about, I was wondering if I would get a question like this.
I'm really fascinated to hear about it because I'm sure you have more than I do even.
Yeah, I think in using the different languages at any given time, and actually I just want to comment, when you said about code switching before, I'm actually terrible at switching between, and I don't mean like speaking English and then using some Japanese words, but actually switching between the languages. I don't think I'm particularly strong at. I prefer to just stay in one, back and forth.
So if someone were to like really quickly open the door behind you and say something in Russian, you'd be like,
Oh no, that would be fine. But I mean, like to switch between chunks of conversation, I think is if I had to translate back and forth, I don't know if I'm that comfortable with it. But
have you ever had any weird experiences with that? Having to code switch and weird. Sorry, so that was a bad question because I actually just want to tell my really quick anecdote. But if you do have any, I want to hear yours too. I one time visited Japan before I lived here with a friend who, we were both young, single, and he was really just interested to like travel and meet girls and try to hook up or whatever. And one time we ended up in a situation where there was two Korean girls, and one of the Korean girls spoke Japanese, and the other one did not. And neither of them spoke English. My friend didn't speak anything but English, and I spoke Japanese. So he wanted to flirt with the girl who only spoke Korean. So it was this U shape of her talking to her friend and her friend talking to me. We literally just played telephone the whole. And it was a funny story, but it was actually like a really boring, it was just a horribly torturous night for the two of us.
Yeah.
Who were just basically like their interpreters.
Yeah.
It was like they were world leaders, and we were negotiating
I don't think I have a story as exciting as that. Sorry.
Okay. Right. Fair enough.
No.
Thank you for letting me share mine.
No problem. Welcome to my show. What was the question again?
So we were talking about code switching. No, about identity and personality.
So I'm very aware. I'd like to think that I'm aware of my situation and what I'm doing at any given time. I don't know if that's always true, but when it comes to language, I'm very aware that I adapt personality to the language I'm speaking. So it's going to sound a little bit silly perhaps, but when I use Russian, I know that I'm a bit more serious, a bit more as I said before, emotional with perhaps my host family and friends. I still have friends back in St. Petersburg and things. But generally it's sort of you lack visual information sharing, if you like, so gestures and smiling and things.
Really?
Are not really that common a thing and with strangers and so forth.
Really?
Yeah. So I feel a little bit more serious in
If you were to gesture a lot, is it seen as rude? Is it seen as how is it seen?
It's foreign.
Okay.
Yeah. Bearing in mind that Russians are generally used to non-Slavs, non-Russians speaking Russian, right? I mean,
they are used to it.
Just and therefore some different cultures. Doesn't necessarily mean they always like the culture or agree with it, but just by fact that there was the USSR before, so there were different populations speaking Russian.
So probably similar then to how English speakers are familiar with a lot of different foreign accents or foreign mannerisms in English.
Yeah. Okay. With Korean and Japanese, I think I feel more. I am careful in the way I interpret relationships, particularly with Korean. making sure I understand who I'm talking to and what that would entail in terms of the levels I would speak. Or
my limited experience. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, so a bit more careful in expressing myself, and in my mind, Koreans are a very expressive population, so so you have to be, I feel, as a foreigner, a little bit careful with that at times. In Japan, I feel I'm probably a little bit more, a little bit quieter than I normally would be in English, if I can say that. As an example, my previous relationship, so I was in a relationship in Korea with a Korean guy, and we actually spoke in English. I met him when I learned English only. When I used English only. Still learning English. And before I learned Korean formally, and we would argue all the time. And I think it was a power thing, dynamic. It was in Japan. So the last relationship I was in was a generally good relationship, and we did not argue. We had one disagreement that I can recall, and it was over something as absurd as getting extra baggage for the airplane. That was the extent of it. So, and I think, and it may be down to confidence, ability. I mean, I learned Japanese quite late. I was in my 30s, and so my level of confidence in the language perhaps is quite different from Russian, certainly, and from Korean.
So
as well.
Is that what you're saying? You were hesitant to argue because or
yeah, but I feel like I know not to. I think, well, I've probably also grown up a little bit, to be honest, as well. I was in my 20s when I was in my relationship with Korean partners, and I think I knew the world. I think I knew all about the world and everything in my 20s and my 30s, and now I kind of acknowledge that I don't. So I tend not to argue in Japanese. It just doesn't seem like something I would do, really, unless it's a formal argument, formal
a debate over policy,
discussion,
or work or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my personality changes, but I get little. My base personality, if you like, my New Zealand personality, come through. So whether that's using sarcasm or fairness, as we were talking about earlier, before the podcast, my values and principles come through at times in the language, but it's a matter of negotiating with the language and the culture you're in.
That's a great way to put it. I felt that in Japanese for sure. I mean, I think in my first probably 15 years of learning Japanese, and then maybe first, I don't know, 6 years of living here, which that's an overlapping time period there. But I was really trying to speak Japanese, as I said before, when I speak Japanese, be as Japanese as possible. Not that I am Japanese, but to approach Japanese just as a Japanese person would speak it, right? As much as humanly possible. And also living here, negotiating the rules and trying to understand how society functions, to really just try to, this is how it's done. This is how it's done. This is partially how I was raised by an immigrant mother in the U.S. That was her approach to living in America. This is how it's done here. It's not a question of whether I like it or not, or whether I agree, because it's not, no one's asking me. So that was how I approached it now, and how I approached it for a long time here. But I've settled in now to kind of what the balance is. That I'm not ever going to be Japanese. And what that really means, as I'm using it now, is that, there's some of my values and my core principles and just my way of relating to people that is set as it is from my cultural matrix and the society I grew up in and all the different influences I've had on me and the ways that I have enjoyed or not enjoyed being treated. And not everyone's going to be exactly the same. And to a certain extent, that is American. It's Southern California. And there's a little bit of maybe Mexican influence in there that I'm a little bit looser with people, for better and for worse, than a Japanese person would be. I'm a lot more ready to drop the formal case once we've gotten to know each other a little bit and just try to be a little bit more open and relaxed and loose. And sometimes that's a great icebreaker with Japanese people. Sometimes they're happy to be like, oh, hey, I'm getting a little bit of a cultural experience with this foreign person without the difficulty of having to speak English to them. And then other people don't like it, but that's part of life of living in a global society. So yeah, I think you said negotiating. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I don't know if it quite relates, but when I was last in Russia, December before last, I just went into a cafe and I ordered just a coffee. I don't remember what it was, and then the lady said something to me, and I wasn't listening actually, so I just asked to repeat, and she was like, oh, you're foreign. I was like, yes, and she goes, oh, I thought you were Russian because you didn't smile. Actually, she literally just said it to me. I'm like, oh, okay.
Hey, you're blending in.
Yeah, blended in. No, but, yeah.
It's funny. Yesterday, Yuki called. I told you we're thinking about buying a place. I don't know, probably an apartment. And
as opposed to a tent,
a house, or a hole in the ground. She
bunker.
Bunker. Yeah. She called the real estate agent, and I just heard her side of the conversation. I was sitting next to her, and it's so funny. It's for her, it's somewhat new. She's definitely gotten used to it pretty quickly, but it's an experience that we all are familiar with living in foreign countries, especially in countries like Korea or Japan, where there really is kind of just one ethnicity and one culture as the main dominant society. But she called, and I could hear the conversation. It was like, she said, okay, how's Friday? How's this Friday? And in the afternoon sometime, yeah. And then, I could guess what the question was based on what her answer was. And then finally I heard her give our name, right? Because she took my last name when we got married, which was what she wanted to do. I kind of almost made the devil's advocate argument. I'm like, are you sure you want to? Here's all the reasons that you might not want to. But finally got to that. I heard her just go, Donkate. And then like the pause, and then just like, no, I'm Japanese. And then the American? Yes, 12 years. Like immediately, once her last name was not a Japanese last name, the next questions were all there's a script there, right? Oh, are you Japanese? Oh, is your husband not Japanese? Where is he from? Yeah. How long has he been in Japan? Like it's an interesting thing because I think actually Americans would almost take offense to that.
Right. But this is kind of going back to what we sort of said in the beginning with rules. And maybe, I don't know, maybe rules is not the right word, but expectations or probabilities. Like you can figure out if my wife makes this phone call about this matter, this is probably going to happen, and I'm not going to get upset about it. I can expect that X, Y, Z is going to happen. Yeah. It's going to be one of those, more than likely X, for example. So that's why I feel like I've had less of a stressful time compared to some of my other friends here, and it's just part and parcel of living.
Yeah, I don't find, because it's different. Like I said, in America that would be rude. Yeah. But it's a different society where there are a lot more mixtures of different cultures and different last names in America. Right. So it is understandable why you should just accept that it's a foreign last name. Right. Whereas in Japan, that's unusual. Yeah. And what is funny though is hearing the reaction she gets, because I don't want to give the impression that I make her always do those phone calls. She's a bit more champing at the bit with the apartment, so she wanted to call him. But when I make those calls, it's very funny because I've had the experience of them thinking I'm Japanese, like when I've called a place and then I've shown up after talking on the phone and then being like, like if I haven't given them my name. But then I've also had the experience of, when I say my name or I show up and they see me, I almost see them go like, oh, that makes sense. Because I think that probably, not to pat myself on the back, but my Japanese often passes as native, but it's not perfectly native. So there's times where I'll see people like, I'll see the light bulb of them like, okay, I wondered why you said that one thing kind of weird. And now I see why. You're not one of us, or something like that. But it's funny with her because they were a lot more confused and had a lot more questions. Whereas with me, when I say like Tonike, they're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
The point you were making about giving last names, and if you were in America, so if, for example, a Japanese person made the same phone call, and the person did react to their name, their last name, as being
it said Tanaka,
and the person on the other line reacted poorly to that, it's if the Japanese person's learned the social cues and etiquette or expectations of the culture, they should know that would be inappropriate, right? So if the person making the phone call goes into it with that sort of mindset, or having learned that, or being aware of that, probably going to have an easier time to know that this name should be okay no matter what it is.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite of Japan, perhaps.
Right.
For the most part, but
what you're talking about is understanding what the borders of normal are, right? Or acceptable. I don't know. Maybe normal's a front word, but that it's not abnormal in Japan to react to a foreign last name and have a bunch of questions. It's a little bit more abnormal in the U.S., for example.
Yeah.
And knowing that it helps you navigate the experience.
Yeah. I was thinking my name is kind of amusing for a lot of people. Yeah. In Japanese, at least, Noel. So it's kind of like, as most people are aware that it's something to do with Christmas. So,
really? Really? I'm surprised that is it from where would they encounter the word Noeru in regards to Christmas?
I don't know, just in the media and things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a lot of people would see it as a very cute name and knowing it's to do with Christmas, from French, right? Noel.
Okay.
Yeah. So, kind of funny like that.
Because I was just thinking that what immediately comes to mind for me is the song "The First Noel," and I have not heard that much in Japan, especially not in English.
I've heard the music. I haven't heard the words.
Right.
Are there words to it? Yes, there are.
Of course there are.
Yeah.
What's that?
Get rid of that bit.
Okay. me singing?
No. Me going, are there words to that? Clearly. Actually, a funny thing to do with names, though, is... I know you're probably short on time. now I'm hosting.
Yeah.
Your name in English and in Japanese and in Spanish, does it change your given name?
Oh, man. Okay.
No, I know you've gone through the process of actually changing your...
I just changed the
family name,
my
but
first name. So the story behind my name change, because I think people, not in any country, people don't often change their name, so people always wonder why.
Yeah.
The thing was, my dad had wanted to spell my name Iain, which is like the Gaelic spelling of it, and because he thought it was cool. My dad has a little bit of a touch of, I think a lot of Americans experience this, where he's so many generations into being in the US and just being like a white American person that there's a bit of like insecurity of like, but I want to have connections with my roots too. And when the transition from the melting pot model to like the salad bowl model happened, I think so there's kind of the ugly reaction that some European descended Americans had, where they're like, well, speak American, like you're here, you don't get to, but I think that's the ugly side of it. I think, but on another side of it, there's a not impossible to understand thing of like, well, we all gave up our, like, we're not German or Irish. We don't know anything about our home ethnicities anymore, and we kind of blended in. I think that some people maybe missed the fact that they were allowed to do that, right? Visually passing for the dominant race allows you to drop, which is not a good. It's good and bad, right? I've experienced that firsthand, and I think we've seen it probably with like Korean people in Japan have that option. If you can pass, some people will choose to pass. But so yeah, I think that there's like, my dad kind of had that, where he's like, well, I want to go back now and resurrect some of the long lost, he's never even met any of the first generation Scottish people who came over to the US in his ancestry, but he wanted that. So he wanted to spell my name Iain. And my mom, coming from a completely different angle of like, she was a first generation immigrant and just wanted to fit in, was like, don't name him anything that can be made fun of in school. Don't make it hard to pronounce. And even the name, even the spelling that they went with Iain was still like, most of my teachers couldn't pronounce it. It's not a common name, and at least in the part of the US that I grew up in, which surprised me when I found out that like in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, it's extremely common.
Yeah.
But
I had friends growing up with that name.
Yeah, but so no, the reason I changed it was because my mom had said to my dad, well, like, look, let's just name him the simple spelling and we'll tell him this story and let him decide later. And it's not like, this is for dad. Actually, I don't have that kind of relationship where I like the Gaelic spelling a little bit. It's maybe just an aesthetic choice for me. It's not that.
Yeah. So my question is, when you are speaking in English and Japanese and Spanish, does the pronunciation of your name change? Do you adapt it to that, or do you keep it? the same?
So the difficulty with my name in Japanese in particular, and to an extent in Spanish, is that the middle vowel, as I say it, as I have grown up pronouncing my own name, is a schwa. It's an unstressed schwa sound, which is like the hardest sound to render into katakana. It's the hardest vowel sound anyway. And the way I've ended up doing it in katakana was literally just how my first really close Japanese friend in junior high school wrote it for me the first time, because what she did, I'm very surprised looking back, and maybe it's because she was a teenager and she didn't know that much about the world yet. Most Japanese people see my name and they've seen soccer players with it or whatever, and just from the spelling they go, it's Ian. Ian, right? Like that's what that name is in katakana. But my friend in junior high school didn't have a default assumption, and she just made me say it like 10 times. She's like, say it again, Ian, say it again, Ian, 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 Ian. And so finally she wrote like E no basu en, so it's Ian as she wrote it. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty much it. It's not it's not en, but that's closer than Ian to how it actually sounds. So I let Japanese people say Ian. I don't correct them if they start calling me Ian. I'm not like militant about it, but I write it Ian, and if anybody asks me, I'll say it 2 or 3 times just so they can hear it, like Ian. And I often get the like, oh, Mizukashi. And I'm like, really? Is it that difficult? But I mean, yeah. So I say Ian, and I try to just say Ian just to like let them hear it, because it's not a Japanese name.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah. In Spanish, it's been such a long time now, to be honest with you. Embarrassed to say I've not been to Mexico in such a very long time. As a kid, I think there was a little bit of that. There's not really a schwa in Spanish either. So I think it was probably similar of like, yeah, but no, I was never Juan. I mean, I think I maybe had a cousin or an aunt, just a very distant. I remember a couple of times being called like Juanito, but it was never my identity. It was never to be Juanito. Like, and you know, my mother's close relatives, my grandmother's close relatives, who knew me and knew my lineage and knew that I was half Mexican, just regarded me as the American kid. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't. Yeah, I don't know. Mexicans are quite like not fussed about that stuff generally. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, my experience has been my name is not especially difficult, I think, but you adapt it to the language that you're using, right? So in Japanese, Noeru, in Korean, Noel.
Noel. Yeah, at least Korean you can get the actual.
Yeah, you get it pretty close if you're going with the French pronunciation.
Yeah.
And of course in English I would just say Noel. Which is kind of the L kind of gets dropped in New Zealand accents anyway.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to a certain extent. So Noel, it's a little bit like a W, Noel. Not the nicest name.
Your name actually, it's one of those names. Even as long as I've known you, like sometimes when I haven't seen you in a while and I'm gonna say it, I'm like, I'm saying Noel, but is that how he says it? I can't remember if you enunciate the E more or not. So when I introduced you at the beginning of the podcast as Noel, part of me, like my stomach flipped of like, I hope this is.
No, that just sounds perfectly American to me.
Okay.
It sounds fine.
All right.
It's adequate variation.
Adequate, all right.
And then in Russian, Noel, which is funny because a lot of Russians, when I give my name, perhaps they might not pick it up and they're like, what? You know, like,
Could you say it one more time?
Yeah, and me?
Yeah, the Russian variant.
Noel.
Interesting.
But it's still written Noel.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes had to break it up like that so they know how to spell it. There's some pronunciation rules with non-emphasized vowels that you have to work with. But so it's always been sort of a funny thing. Yeah, because your name, as I said to you before with the case system in Russian, for example, your name, the ending on your name will change depending on what that name is doing in the sentence. So if it's to Noel, it'll be Noelu, like that. Or if
it's like direct address if I'm calling or something.
Yeah. Or if it's if you want to say of Noel or from Noel, whatever, Noelia, like that. That kind of difference there, so it has consequences. So yeah, it's interesting. I also wanted to point out, actually, which I didn't point out in the beginning, that I studied Russian in Russia and every language I've studied in the country.
Yeah.
But I also studied Russian at university in New Zealand before they closed that program down.
After going to Russia?
Yeah. When I returned to New Zealand, I actually did my second and third year Russian studies, undergrad. Yeah. As well, but they've since ceased that program. So Yeah.
I think I wanted to ask you much closer to the beginning, and maybe this will just wrap up with some lighter questions.
Yeah.
But I don't think I finished asking the question, or I don't remember if you answered it. But what for you, like learning the languages you've learned, what is the skill you mastered first? There's a variety of skills that are common. Like you've got to learn the pronunciation, you've got to learn the grammar, you've got to become literate in it, and there's sub skills to each one.
Yeah, you did ask that actually.
Yeah. Did you say?
I don't think I answered.
Okay.
I think it comes down to also, you see it probably in my humor, if I can say that. Imitation. So the sort of the sounds that I hear in the language, I tend to be able to pick up first and just repeat without necessarily understanding what I'm saying, perhaps. So I think if that answers your question.
Pronunciation.
Yeah, so I tend to mimic things. I mean, I do it at home on the TV if I hear American accents or whatever. Now, even I'll just repeat the stupid word that Anderson Cooper is saying or something.
Dude, you and I are so alike that way. Because sorry, I'm way too far from the mic there. You and I are so alike because that's exactly, I think there's a direct link between my love of doing impressions and not in any mean-spirited way. It's sensitive because you can't necessarily, sometimes when I'm at home cooking, same thing with the TV, I'll just mimic what I've just heard. But it's not something I would necessarily do in front of people because it can come off quite
I actually have a very specific moment. So in Korean, I remember in my very first year, and as I said to you before, I was studying Korean a lot by myself, trying to sort of work through a workbook or whatever. And I would watch TV, and I remember it was like in the morning before I had to go to work, and the Home Shopping Network was on, and they were selling something. And a rather tricky sound for foreigners is the L sound in Korean, which is kind of sound. And it's a very important, it's a significant sound in Korean. It's used as part of the object marker anyway. And I remember just I kept hearing it in the Home Shopping show, and the lady kept saying it, and then I just started imitating it. I was like, oh, and then I actually remember the moment that I actually was like, oh yes, I got it, and curl my tongue way back, way up. Yeah, so I still hold on to that.
It's funny because it's not something that often gets talked about this way, but it's muscle training. It's 100% muscle training because the way that your mouth and tongue are used to moving, like in the same way that your legs and feet are used to moving when you walk, or your arms and your hips and all that, is defined by what they do all the time. And so if you just speak English all the time, you have the English muscle sets down, but you have to build up the strength and the balance for the other ones as well.
Yeah. Are there sounds in Japanese that are difficult for you to produce still?
Now?
Yeah, or at least maybe in the beginning?
I have a little bit of like a shortened tongue, and even in English I have a bit of a lisp, and that sometimes makes the...
we can edit that out.
Darirurero line somewhat difficult. I've gotten that now. I think Spanish helped me with that because it's much closer to the Spanish R. Yeah. It's not exactly the same, but it's closer.
I see the same point with Russian, so there's R as well. R. Yeah. And that's useful once you've learned it in one language, maybe similar to another one. Yeah. So it's helpful there.
One thing I can't do you know what bidakuon is?
Oh, yeah.
It's mostly gone in informally commonly used Japanese. But bidakuon is a feature of it's a bit abstract and obscure to point out, but where there's a sound in Japanese, the sound.
Sorry, I was agreeing with you.
That it is a sound unto itself, but sometimes in bidakuon, I'm not even 100% sure what the rule is, but it's an elegant sounding way of pronouncing Japanese. That is expected of people who were like television news anchors or stuff, and giving political speeches that the average people don't often use. But before, like, for example, ga, the voiced. So there's the unvoiced version of it would be ka, and then the voiced version would be ga, and the elegant bidakuon way of saying ga is nga, where you it's almost like a glottal stop before the. I don't know if that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, kind of sort of nasalized and palatalized. I don't know. But I read something not long ago that even in like gi, that it sort of sometimes happens there that people use it and go, I can't quite do it, ni, perhaps as well. But I think I've heard it a lot I'm aware of it in announcements and in Tokyo, actually.
Well, because
Yeah.
it is
The standard.
standard
Yeah.
and upper class
Yeah.
or sophisticated sounding, so to speak. I said upper class. That's actually a bit of a misnomer, because that's an interesting thing I find about Japanese is how little of a role social class plays in region. Definitely,
Yeah.
a huge part of accents here, but social class, not like British English, for example.
Yeah. Years ago I read the relationship between the ng and the k sound, so k kind of sound, so that, and including so the k sound is harsher and it's more it was described as more abstract, whereas the ng is more personalized, which probably sounds a little bit weird, but and so that's reflected in the speech that way.
Oh, okay.
And so the personalized one is more polite in certain areas.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So one last thing, you might already know this, but as somebody who likes your, like you said, just finding stuff out.
Yeah.
You may already know this, but I was listening to a friend of mine because this is the kind of conversations I have. A friend of mine sent me after basically we had talked about this stuff, sent me a woman reading Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji, which is sometimes considered the oldest novel in the world. It's a really important work of Japanese literature and Japanese literary history. Sent me a YouTube video of a woman reading Genji Monogatari in the pronunciation of that time. Of course, it's reconstructed. It's not 100% definite that it's accurate, but reading it in that. And one thing I was very surprised, I noticed that a bunch of things kept jumping out at me, and then I wrote back to my friend who sent it to me, and she was like, yeah, that's because this evolved this way, and there's a lot of stuff I didn't know, and sometimes my assumptions about how modern Japanese had evolved were backwards, were the opposite of what had happened. For example, like hahihuheho, the hu sound,
Mm-hmm.
I assumed that was an aberrant thing. Right, that you had ha, he, so they're H sounds, all of them, but hu is not quite an F. It's usually rendered as an F in English. It's like Mount Fuji. We say Fuji, but it's actually Fuji. It's almost like you just make a little circle with your lips and blow air out through it.
To do it like a
Yeah. But it's the reverse. That those sounds are originally and much stronger and harsher sounding fa fi fu fe fo. And that they've softened over time. And I forget what the term she used. It's like frontolabial shortening or something. That the tendency as this Japanese phonology is evolving is to move the lips less and less. That a lot of sounds which require more movement of the front of the front of the mouth and the lips are being softened and reduced. So that actually it was originally an F sound, fa fi fu fe fo, that has changed into ha hi hu he ho. And that was really weird to hear. Even like the topic marker particle, like karewa, I think she even, because that's ha, it's written ha, I think she was even saying karefa, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, there was a lot of words there it was fa instead of ha, and you can hear in a very layman, sort of ignorant, just my perception of it, you can hear that you can hear sort of common ancestry with Korean more at that when it's in the older version.
For a time I read a little bit in historical linguistics. When I was living in Korea, the relationship between the two languages, and I remember reading that hopefully I get the kingdoms right. One of the kingdoms in Korea was called pt2, and they spoke Korean, what Koreans consider a Korean language, different from the Seoul-based one, which the name now escapes me. But the pt2 kingdom didn't need interpreters for speaking with the native Japanese population. That they only needed interpreters when speaking to those in Seoul.
Really?
Yeah. And I don't think that's a very widely known or accepted sort of idea. And certainly politically, it doesn't really fit.
I almost don't even completely understand that.
Oh, so there's a unified kingdom, but before that, there were separate kingdoms and things. And so the pt2 had a lot of diplomatic relations with Japan. But they didn't need interpreters in terms of the languages.
Super. So is it that Sorry. I was gonna ask an either or question, but I realized it has to be both. I was gonna say, was Japanese at the time closer to that version of Korean, or was that version of Korean closer?
What
to
I was
Japanese,
reading, that was the argument. Yeah, I mean that was many years ago.
That's very fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like I've heard anecdotally, I've had a lot of friends have the experience of speaking Spanish to an Italian speaker and having the Italian speaker speak back in Italian, and sometimes not even realizing right away of going like, something's up with this guy's Spanish, but I don't know what it is.
Actually, yeah. When I was in Kiev, Kiev in Russian, or Kiev in my New Zealand accent, but also in Ukrainian, I constantly encountered, and I knew this about Kiev before, but it's both a Russian and a Ukrainian speaking city. Mm-hmm. Now, the languages are very close together, right? They're both Slavic languages and are closer together than French and Italian, for example, from what I have heard. Mm-hmm. So I would, talk to people, go shopping, whatever, and I would speak Russian to them, knowing that I could, and that was, knowing that it was possible for them to understand me when I say I could. And they would reply. Now, they would reply either in Russian or in Ukrainian. And the Ukrainian, I could get a gist of it sometimes. Not always, depending on the conversation. But it sort of confounded me. Like, why would people just reply in a different language, And I asked one woman about this. And she said, well, and this was a year and a half ago. So bear in mind the politics of it. They said, well, we're proud of our language. We want to use our language. So that's certainly perhaps a feature more of younger people, maybe. But certainly the politics of Russia invading the Crimea and sure. the eastern border.
Sure, there's been a reaction to that.
Yeah. And also sort of post-Soviet times as well. But she also said, we're proud of our language. And we can just choose whatever language we want to speak because we both understand each other. Yeah. So meaning that a person who is Ukrainian from Ukraine and perhaps speaks Russian as a native language will inevitably, if they're living in Kiev, also know Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. So you can just communicate with whichever language you wish, or which one you're more comfortable with, and you will get a response in either of those. But being a foreigner, that's a slightly different matter, of course. Yeah. But it was fascinating. It really blew my mind.
That's a very interesting approach to that.
And yet, sometimes it happens actually at school, where I work now, and I'm sure you've certainly experienced it as well, where a Japanese staff member will speak to you in Japanese, and then you might just reply in English.
It's interesting because that school, I think I've experienced that more than anywhere else in Japan when I worked there, is that there's whole conversations where each person never speaks the other person's language.
Yeah, and I still do that, and I don't actually know why I do that. I think it's probably, it's not out of pride of my language. I think it's just more of a comfort thing. So maybe
people are busy and they don't want to expend extra energy, I think.
Yeah. But also if I know that the person will understand.
Right.
I mean, so it is somewhat similar to the Kiev experience.
It sounds like it.
It was interesting. On the, not the flip side, but in a variation of that, so I went to Belarus this last winter here, and I knew a little bit about the language situation there, which is that there is a separate Belarusian language. Mm-hmm. It's also close to Russian. I read that it's closer to Ukrainian actually, but still very close to Russian. But the population generally speak Russian all the time. So the signage and everything would typically be in Belarusian. Uh-huh. In Ukraine, it was both Russian and Ukrainian actually, or just Ukrainian sometimes. But in Belarus, the signs and so forth were usually in Belarusian, but everyone would speak Russian. And I didn't hear any Belarusian that I was aware of. It may have been a case of that the languages are sometimes so similar that it just sounds like a slight dialect or something like that, or a variation. But the only time I was actually aware of someone speaking Belarusian to me was on my very last day, and I went to a souvenir shop, and it was a really nice souvenir shop, and the guy only spoke Belarusian to me, and so that struck me as quite marked. Like it was, whoa, okay, I'm hearing this, for the first time.
That's very interesting too. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, well, I think the past connection with Russia, obviously. the Russian was the state language before, in terms of the Soviet Union, of course, and there was a level of prestige to it, or an expectation that everyone would in the USSR that they would learn it or speak it. And I think what's at least from my perspective now, I said to you, I bought some books on Belarusian grammar and vocabulary and things, not because I intend to learn it, but because I like that reference. I like to be able to look through and see patterns and so forth. But the actual planning of the language was very, very late into the 20th century. So mid-20th century, as a deliberate sort of project
to standardize
the language. And what I would say are some deficiencies in the Russian orthography are corrected in the Belarusian one.
Oh, interesting.
So that the unstressed O, the unstressed O sound in Russian, the same word will often may occur in Belarusian as well, but they would spell it phonetically, whereas in Russian it's perhaps more morphophonemic.
Interesting. Yeah.
So they would so that they could, because pronunciation stress changes in both languages, all sort of kind of all over the place. It's not quite regular. You have to kind of just learn it. But the spelling was altered in Belarusian. I don't know if that was to make it a more phonetic spelling system. I would assume so, knowing sort of how Soviet linguists worked before. A more demographic. Demographic sort of approach to the language, or if it was for some other reason, but it seems to be that.
Well, it's been really great having you on, Noel. I really don't want to cut you off. I could probably talk to you for another hour or two here, but I unfortunately have to run and go handle some other things. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and I'd love to have you on again if you would like to. I think as I said, we could continue. So thanks so much for your time today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.